Hi, it's Keith from the Evangelical Free Church, Stony Stratford. And we're continuing our series of short talks in the Gospel of Luke. And today we come to Luke chapter 21, verses 20 to 24. Now, a few weeks back, we were looking at the question that the disciples had asked Jesus. When they pointed to the grandeur of the temple as they were leaving it, Jesus basically said, well, take a good look, because sometime in the future, it's all going to be torn down. So, verse 7 of this chapter, they come to him. Teacher, they asked, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to take place? Now, Jesus has started to explain what will happen and how they're realizing they're moving towards a time when these things will happen, with the destruction of the temple being a climax to that. First thing, false teachers will come. There'd be times of national upheaval and persecution. But he encourages them to stand firm, and God will be with them. There's a saying, isn't there? And I think this is very much what Jesus is doing here, that to be forewarned is to be forearmed. In other words, even if you have bad news, being prepared for it and being ready for it is much better than being totally unprepared. So Jesus now continues to warn and tell them what the signs will be that this time is drawing near. So he says that, firstly, that events are going to happen in their lifetime. Verse 20, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. That's a pretty big sign and a pretty easy one to see. But then he has more advice. Verse 21, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because very often in times of war, people have in the past fled, particularly in the ancient world, fled to a stronghold, fled to a city. But Jesus basically says, run for the hills. In AD 70, there was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And it's interesting that in that time of persecution, when the Romans really had got fed up with the rebellion of the Jews, it's reckoned round about 1 million were killed and about 100,000 taken into captivity. But Jesus points out something more than just a time of suffering. This is actually a time of judgment, because warnings had been given. Verse 22, for this is a time of punishment in fulfillment of all that had been written. Jesus had at one time commented as he wept over Jerusalem that they'd been warned time and time again by the prophets, but they had taken no notice. And there's plenty of evidence of that. We can see that in Hosea chapter 9, verse 7, and Jeremiah 6, verse 6 is very explicit about the fall of Jerusalem. He mentions that this is going to be a time of great suffering. It's going to be a time of great distress, and a time actually of people being exiled, and what we'd call today a national disgrace. In the end, he says this, they will fall by the sword and be taken prisoners to all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. This is really, as I said earlier, like the end of the world for the Jews. The reason the disciples had come to Jesus and asked the question about the temple's destruction in the first place was they could not imagine a time, a country, a nationality without the temple at the centre. But here's the interesting thing. Some Christians, or a lot of Christians actually, heeded these warnings And many of them fled from Jerusalem in AD 70 when they saw these things coming to pass. There's no doubt where Jesus says, as we looked at last week, verse 18, not a hair of your head will perish. He was undoubtedly referring to that, not just spiritual preservation, but literally physical preservation for the people of the time. Well, what does this teach us today? In the book of Joel, we can read this in verse 30 through to the first part of 32. I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. We see as we look on in this passage that there are two layers to this prophecy. There's one that undoubtedly was talking about the time the disciples were living in, but there's another one that talks of the future. But here's the thing, wherever time we live and whatever our future, just as Jesus was warning his disciples and warning his followers to depart the city, to flee from the judgment when the time came, there is a wonderful promise that we can call out to the Lord and know his salvation. And that's really what Easter is all about. We're going to be thinking about that in the next few weeks. We'll be looking at the Easter message. But I'd like to urge you to read a biography of Jesus. This is what the Gospels are. They're literally a biography of his ministry, his life, his death, his resurrection, and best of all, what it means. Now, these are free on the railings of the church, or you're going to be seeing me out on the street from time to time. I have a table with these on. You're very willing to come up, engage me in conversation, or not, depending on how you feel. But these are free, and we'd love to give you one to read over Easter. It's just a quick read. Thank you so much for listening.